What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was a folded, brittle piece of paper tucked inside your late mother's Bible? For 19-year-old Ruth Cole, that paper was a deed. The property it named a place she had never heard of, and the price she had paid for it was everything. She was turned out of her childhood home in the damp Somerset village of Brentwick, with nothing but a small bundle of clothes and the grief of a freshly buried father. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten stone cottage, 3 miles down a lane no one ever used, was a secret her mother had kept for 20 years, a legacy of such quiet power it would rewrite not only Ruth's future, but the very memory of the woman who had borne her. Settle in and let us know in the comments where you are watching from, as we follow the story of a dismissed girl, a ruined cottage, and the hidden treasure that connected them both. The morning air was thin and sharp, carrying the smell of wet coal smoke and colder rain to come. Ruth Cole stood on the cobbled lane, the heavy oak door of her home closing behind her with a sound of absolute finality. Her stepmother had not even watched her go. Inside the house were the ghosts of her father, the scent of his pipe tobacco still clinging to the curtains, the worn hollow in his armchair by the fire. Outside was nothing, just the gray sky, the muddy track leading away from the village, and the meager weight of her possessions wrapped in a shawl. She was pale and worn, her dress a mended gray wool that seemed to absorb the bleakness of the day. She had said nothing as her stepmother listed her failings, her uselessness, her lack of a marriage prospect. She had simply nodded, taken the small Bible her own mother had left her, and walked out. Now, with the village of Brentwick shrinking behind her, she sat on a cold stone wall to catch her breath, her future an empty page. She opened the Bible, its leather cover softened with age, its pages whispering as they turned. Her mother, Anne, had been a quiet, almost invisible woman who had died of a fever when Ruth was just a child. She existed now only in fragments of memory. The smell of lavender and soap, the feel of a cool hand on a hot forehead, the low hum of a song she could no longer name. Between the fragile pages of Psalms, a folded paper fell into her lap. It was not a pressed flower, as she first thought, but a legal document. The ink faded to the color of rust. It was a deed of ownership, dated 20 years prior, for a property named the Scribe's Rest, located on Blackwood Lane. The owner was listed as Anne Cole, a property her father had never spoken of, a place no one had ever mentioned. It was a ruin, surely, a plot of sour land. Why else would it have been forgotten? Yet it was hers now, her only inheritance. She folded the paper, its creases sharp as a promise or a warning, and tucked it into her bodice. With no other direction to go, Ruth stood up and began to walk toward the place on the map, a place that held the last secret of a mother she barely knew. What she would find there was far more than shelter. It was an identity, waiting patiently in the dust and the dark. But first, she had to survive the ruin itself. Her journey was 3 miles on foot, along a lane that quickly dissolved from a rutted track into little more than a green path between overgrown hedgerows. The air grew stiller, the sounds of the village fading completely, replaced by the drip of water from slick blackthorn branches and the call of a distant crow. By the time she reached the marker described on the deed, an ancient split oak tree, the drizzle had thickened into a persistent, chilling rain. There, set back from the lane behind a crumbling stone wall, was the property. The Scribe's Rest. It was worse than she could have possibly imagined. The roof sagged in the middle like a broken back, a gaping hole showing black against the gray sky. Slates lay shattered in the weeds below. The windows were dark, hollow eyes, either boarded over or smashed out. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, had consumed one entire wall, its tendrils prying at the mortar between the stones. A small, rusted iron gate hung from a single hinge, the nameplate obscured by moss and time. This was not a home. It was a grave, a place for things to be forgotten. A wave of despair so cold and heavy it nearly buckled her knees washed over her. She had walked all this way, fueled by a desperate, foolish flicker of hope, only to find this derelict shell, this final, cruel joke. For a long moment, she simply stood in the rain, the water plastering her thin dress to her skin, and stared. The silence of the place was profound, a dead quiet that felt ancient and unwelcoming. She thought of turning back, of begging for work at some farm, of sleeping in a barn. Anything would be better than this. But the image of her stepmother's face, tight with contempt, stopped her. There was nothing to go back to. This place, this ruin, was all she had. Taking a deep, ragged breath, she pushed the groaning gate open and walked into the overgrown yard. The front door was swollen shut, its wood green with damp. She circled the small house, her boots sinking into the mud, until she found a low window where the boards had rotted away. She pulled them loose and, without a second thought for her dress, hoisted herself over the sill and dropped into the darkness within. The air was thick with the smell of mold, decay, and the droppings of countless small animals. It was a place of utter neglect, a testament to abandonment. Her inheritance was nothing more than a pile of stones and sorrow. Is this the end of her hope, or the very beginning of her true life? What secret could possibly lie buried in such a place of ruin that would be worth 20 years of silence? And would a young woman with nothing to her name have the strength to uncover it? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet discovery. Now back to Ruth, standing in the heart of her desolate inheritance. Ruth knew she could not stay in that damp, crumbling cottage without supplies. The last of her father's pocket money, a few carefully saved shillings and pence, was tied in a handkerchief in her pocket. It would have to be enough. The next morning, she walked back to Brentwick, her shoulders squared against the memory of her departure and the certainty of the reception she would receive. The village folk, who had known her since birth, now looked through her as if she were a ghost. They had seen her cast out. She was no longer one of them. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves as she made her way to the general store. "That's the Cole girl," she heard a woman murmur. "Sleeping in the old ruin on Blackwood Lane, they say. The Scribe's Rest. Cursed, that place is." She bought a small sack of flour, a packet of tea, a tin of matches, and a single tallow candle, the coins feeling impossibly light as she handed them over. As she stepped out of the shop, her path was blocked by a large, imposing figure. Mr. Silas Croft, the man who owned half the village and held the mortgage on the house that was no longer hers. He was a man built of beef and condescension, his face ruddy with wealth and impatience. He looked down at her, a sneer playing on his thick lips. "Well, Ruth Cole," he boomed, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "I hear you've come into property, trading a respectable house for a pile of stones and rats. A fine bargain." He laughed, a short, barking sound. "Your mother was a strange one, and it seems the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. You'll be begging for scraps before the first frost. Mark my words." Ruth said nothing. She met his gaze for a single, steady moment, her face pale, but her expression unreadable. Then she stepped around him and continued on her way. his laughter echoing behind her. Her silence seemed to enrage him more than any retort could have. Her path back took her past the edge of the village, where the neat cottages gave way to more weathered dwellings. In the garden of the last cottage sat an old woman, her back bent over a patch of herbs. It was Elspeth, a widow who had lived there as long as anyone could remember. She was a creature of folklore to the village children, ancient and wise, and mostly left alone. As Ruth passed, Elspeth looked up, her eyes a startlingly clear blue in her wrinkled face. She did not smile, but her gaze was direct, seeing more than the worn dress and the thin frame. "Some seeds only sprout in spoiled earth, child," the old woman said, her voice dry and raspy as a corn husk. "Mind you tend the right ones." The words were strange, nonsensical, yet they settled in Ruth's mind, a small, hard stone of meaning she could not yet grasp. She nodded once in acknowledgement and walked on, leaving the mockery of the village behind and carrying the cryptic warning with her, back to the silent, waiting ruin. That evening, the journey back to the Scribe's Rest felt different. It was no longer a journey to an unknown destination, but a return to a place that was, however wretched, hers. The meager supplies in her sack felt like a king's ransom. The single candle, a beacon. As dusk settled, the stone house took on a softer shape, less a skull and more a sleeping animal hunkered down in the overgrown landscape. The light was fading fast, the air turning the deep, bruised blue of twilight. She lit her candle inside, the small flame pushing back the immense darkness, creating a tiny circle of wavering, golden light. The shadows it cast were deep and menacing, dancing in the corners, turning piles of debris into lurking figures. The first night was a trial of courage. Every groan of the old timbers, every skittering sound in the walls, every sigh of the wind through the broken roof was magnified in the oppressive silence. She did not sleep on the damp floorboards of the main room, but found a small pantry, slightly drier and more sheltered. She wrapped herself in her mother's old wool shawl, its faint scent of lavender a comfort against the smell of decay, and huddled against the cold stone. Sometime after midnight, a new sound broke the pattern, a soft scratching at the broken window she had entered through. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scratching came again, followed by a low, plaintive cry. It was not human. Holding her candle high, she crept to the opening. Two luminous green eyes blinked back at her from the darkness. It was a cat, a creature of skin and bone, its fur a matted black. It was as much an outcast as she was. It looked at her with a desperate, wary intelligence. Moved by a sudden kinship, Ruth broke off a small piece of the dry bread she had bought and tossed it onto the floor. The cat darted in, snatched the crust, and retreated to the shadows to devour it. It did not leave. It settled in a far corner, a small, dark shape watching her, and for the first time since leaving her home, Ruth did not feel entirely alone. She named him Soot. For days, she and the cat existed in a quiet truce, two solitary beings inhabiting the same ruin. She did not try to repair or clean. She simply lived in the space, listening to the rain drum on the remaining slates, to the wind's mournful song, to the deep, settled silence of a place that had been abandoned for a very long time. The initial disappointment remained, a hard knot in her stomach, but something else was beginning to grow beside it. A stubborn, quiet resolve. This place was hers. Weeks passed in a rhythm of simple survival. Ruth's days were consumed by the immense, thankless task of making the Scribe's Rest habitable. She began by clearing the main room, shoveling years of dirt, leaves, and rubble out of the broken window. She used loose stones from the collapsed garden wall to build up the fireplace, and with the help of Thomas, a young carter from a neighboring village who had been kind to her father, she managed to haul a few scavenged timbers to patch the worst of the hole in the roof. He asked no questions, simply offering a sad smile and the strength of his arms for an hour. Her hands, once soft, were now chapped and calloused, her nails permanently rimmed with dirt. Soot became her constant, silent companion. He would sit on a dusty beam above her, watching her work with an unnerving focus, his green eyes tracking her every move. At night, he would curl up at the foot of her makeshift bed of sacks, a small, warm weight in the vast, cold darkness. One afternoon, while trying to secure a piece of oiled canvas over a broken window pane in the small parlor, she noticed something odd. The wall adjacent to the great stone chimney was different from the others. The plaster was smoother, a slightly paler gray, as if applied years after the original construction. She had paid it no mind before, but now, with the low autumn sun slanting through the room, she saw the faint outline of what might have been a window, bricked up and plastered over. It made no sense. Why would anyone seal a window in a room that was already so dark? She ran her hand over the surface. It was cold and solid. A trick of the light, perhaps. She dismissed it, turning her attention back to the more pressing matter of keeping the rain out. But the image of the phantom window stayed with her. The true clue, when it came, was not from sight, but from the behavior of her companion. Soot, who explored every nook and cranny of the dilapidated house without fear, gave that particular wall a wide berth. He would stop at the threshold of the parlor, fur slightly raised, and stare at the wall before turning and walking away. One evening, as Ruth sat mending a tear in her dress by candlelight, she saw him do something stranger still. He crept into the room, low to the ground, and began batting at a loose stone in the foundation, directly beneath the plastered-over section. A sharp, almost frantic patting. He hissed at the stone, a low, guttural sound. Curious, Ruth put down her sewing and knelt beside him. She pulled the stone free. Behind it was not the dark earth she expected, but a narrow, black void. A sliver of air, cool and unnaturally dry, breathed out from the gap, carrying a faint, peculiar scent. It was not the smell of damp or decay. It was the clean, sharp scent of linseed oil, old paper, and something else. Something floral and faintly chemical. She held her candle to the hole, but the light was swallowed by the darkness. She pushed the stone back into place, her mind racing. An entire section of wall, sealed off from the rest of the house. Soot looked up at her, blinked his slow, knowing green eyes, and began to purr. The sealed wall became an obsession. Ruth would find herself staring at it for long stretches, running her hands over its smooth, blank surface, trying to understand. What was her mother hiding, and why go to such lengths to conceal it? The cryptic words of old Elspeth echoed in her memory. Mind you tend the right ones. Perhaps this was the spoiled earth the old woman had spoken of. The need to know what lay behind that wall became a physical ache, a driving force that overshadowed the daily hardship of her life. She continued her labor, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. Every stone she cleared from the garden, every bucket of water she hauled from the old well, every nail she hammered into a loose floorboard was an act of claiming not just the house, but the secret it held. The physical work hardened her body and clarified her mind. She felt a connection to the place growing, a sense of stewardship. Her hands learned the house in a way her mind could not. They knew the particular grit of the mortar, the worn grain of the oak lintel over the door, the cold, honest weight of the stones. A memory surfaced one afternoon as she was scrubbing the soot from the fireplace. It was of her mother's hands. She had been small, perhaps 4 or 5, watching her mother grind something in a small stone mortar. Her mother's fingers were stained with brilliant colors, a startling blue, a vibrant crimson. When Ruth had asked what she was doing, her mother had simply smiled and said, "Making colors for the angels, my love." At the time, it had made perfect sense. Now the memory was a key turning in a lock. She remembered her mother, a laborer's wife, with the hands of an artist. That evening, she made her decision. She found an old iron pry bar in the collapsed shed at the back of the property, its end rusted to a sharp edge. She took her single candle and went into the parlor. Soot followed, but stopped at the doorway, watching, his tail twitching. With a deep breath, Ruth wedged the end of the pry bar into a crack near the loose foundation stone and heaved. A chunk of plaster broke away, revealing not old stone, but the clean, uniform lines of red brick. It was new work, deliberate. Someone had built a wall inside a wall. Her heart began to beat a heavy, steady rhythm, a drumbeat of anticipation. With methodical force, she began to pry the bricks loose one by one. The work was slow and exhausting. Each brick she loosened and pulled from the wall felt like uncovering a word in a long-forgotten sentence. Finally, after more than an hour of sweat and labor, she created an opening large enough to peer through. She pushed the candle into the void. A wave of cool, perfectly dry air washed over her face, carrying that same strange, clean scent, now much stronger. It smelled of vellum, of gum arabic, of aged wood and bottled pigments. It was the smell of a place untouched by time and damp. She pulled away a few more bricks, making the hole large enough to squeeze through, and hoisted herself into the darkness. She stood, holding the candle aloft. The wavering light revealed not a void, but a room. A small, perfect, hidden chamber. In the center stood a heavy oak desk, its surface smooth and unblemished. On it sat a row of stoppered glass bottles containing crystallized powders of impossible color. Lapis lazuli, vermilion, malachite. There were brushes with tips as fine as a single hair, quills cut to sharp points, and slabs of polished granite for grinding pigments. It was a workshop, a secret scriptorium. On a small shelf, a stack of uncut vellum sheets waited, creamy and perfect, and on the desk itself, laid open as if its owner had just stepped away for a moment, was a large leather portfolio. With trembling fingers, Ruth untied the ribbons and opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. Page after page of illuminated manuscripts lay before her, the colors so vibrant they seemed to hum in the candlelight. There were intricate borders of twining ivy and gold leaf flowers, capital letters transformed into mythical beasts, and passages of scripture written in a hand so elegant and precise it looked like black lace. Some were finished masterpieces, others were practice sheets, studies of a bird's wing or the fall of light on a fold of cloth. It was the work of a master, a genius of the art. Beneath the desk, her searching hands found a loose floorboard. She lifted it. Inside was a small iron strongbox. It wasn't locked. She lifted the heavy lid. It contained not coins, but ledgers filled with neat columns of figures, detailing commissions and payments from clients as far away as London and Bath, all handled through a solicitor. And beneath the ledgers, A single folded letter, addressed in that same perfect hand. To my daughter, Ruth. The letter explained everything. Her mother, Anne, was the daughter of a master illuminator. This was her art, her trade, her passion. She had built this secret room to continue her work after marrying a simple farmer, hiding her gift from a world that would not understand it. The house, the work, the legacy, it was all for Ruth. A dowry of skill, not silver, a quiet inheritance of purpose. Just as this new reality began to settle over her, the weather turned. A great storm, which had been threatening for days, finally broke over the valley. It was a tempest of biblical fury. Wind howled around the small stone house, shrieking through the cracks in the walls. Rain came down not in sheets, but in solid, driving waves that hammered against the roof and walls. The scribe's rest, already weakened by years of neglect, groaned under the assault. Ruth rushed to move her mother's precious work, carrying the portfolio, the ledgers, and the box of supplies from the main house into the sanctuary of the hidden workshop. Not a moment too soon. With a deafening crack, a large section of the newly patched roof over the main room gave way. Water and debris poured in, instantly flooding the floor she had worked so hard to clear. The storm was trying to reclaim the house, to wash away the progress she had made. She huddled in the workshop, the door blocked by a heavy chest, listening to the destruction outside, her heart a cold stone of fear in her chest. In a brief lull in the wind's screaming, she heard a sound, a desperate, frantic pounding on the front door. At first, she thought it was the storm, a branch thrown against the wood. But it came again, accompanied by a faint shout, nearly lost in the gale. Someone was out there. Her first instinct was to stay hidden, to protect the secret she had just discovered. But the thought of anyone, any living soul, being caught in this tempest was too much to bear. Taking her candle, she unblocked the workshop door and waded through the flooded main room. With a great effort, she heaved the swollen front door open. A man stood on the threshold, drenched and desperate, shielding a small child wrapped in a blanket. Behind him, a woman, her face pale with exhaustion and fear, clung to his arm. "Please," the man begged, his voice hoarse. "Our cart. The wheel broke on the lane. My wife, she is with child." Without a word, Ruth stood aside and ushered them in, out of the wind and the punishing rain. She led them past the devastation in the main room, into the one safe, dry place she had, the workshop. They stared in wonder at the strange room, the colors, the papers, the tools of an art they couldn't name. But Ruth saw only their need. She stirred the embers in the workshop's small hearth, adding the last of her dry kindling to build a small, welcoming fire. She gave them her last loaf of bread and the blanket from her own bed. She heated water for tea, her movements calm and sure. She was no longer just the inheritor of a secret. She was the keeper of a sanctuary. In that small, hidden room, surrounded by her mother's legacy, she sheltered this family from the storm, sharing what little she had. In that single act of selfless compassion, she fully claimed her inheritance, understanding that its true value lay not in its monetary worth, but in its power to provide shelter, warmth, and hope. The storm passed by morning, leaving a world washed clean and broken. The man she had sheltered, a carpenter named John, was true to his word. As soon as he had repaired his cart and settled his family safely in the next village, he returned with his tools and a supply of seasoned oak. In 2 days of steady work, fueled by Ruth's thin stew and his own gratitude, they built a new, stronger frame for the roof. He would take no payment, saying only, "A safe harbor is worth more than coin, miss." The story of the girl in the ruin who had given shelter during the great storm began to travel. It was a simple story, but it shifted the village's perception of her. The whispers were no longer of a fool or a ghost, but of a quiet, resilient strength. Curiosity replaced contempt. Following the instructions in her mother's letter, Ruth packed a small selection of the most beautiful finished pages into a protective oilskin pouch and made the journey to Bath. She found the solicitor's office, a respectable establishment with a polished brass plaque. Mr. Abernathy was an elderly man with kind eyes behind spectacles. When Ruth introduced herself as the daughter of Anne Cole and unwrapped the pages, his professional calm dissolved into astonishment. "Good heavens," he murmured, tracing a golden vine with a reverent finger. "So this is her. I have managed her accounts for 15 years and never knew her name, only her initial and the quality of her work. I always wondered." He authenticated the ledgers, and with a grave sense of duty, arranged for an expert from a London gallery to visit the scribe's rest. The arrival of a fine carriage in front of the once derelict cottage sent a shockwave through Brentwick. Mr. Silas Croft, seeing the commotion, strode down the lane, a self-satisfied smirk on his face, expecting to find bailiffs evicting the girl. He arrived just as the expert, a thin, impeccably dressed man, was examining a page in the sunlight. "It is unmistakable," the man declared, his voice carrying in the still air. "The technique, the purity of the pigment. It is the work of the Somerset illuminator, a provincial master, anonymous until now. This collection, it is a national treasure. Its value is considerable." Croft's face went from ruddy to pale. He stared at Ruth, who stood quietly by the door, and then at the small, solid stone house he had dismissed as a pile of rocks. He saw not a ruin, but a fortress he could not breach, built of a currency he did not understand. Without a word, he turned and walked away. His broad shoulders slumped in the first posture of defeat Ruth had ever seen him wear. That evening, as she walked through the village, people nodded to her. The baker's wife pressed a warm loaf of bread into her hands. The mockery had turned to respect, the laughter to awe. Spring came to Blackwood Lane, and with it, a gentle transformation. The scribe's rest no longer hunkered against the earth, but seemed to rise to meet the sun. The new roof was sound and weatherproof. The windows were glazed with fresh glass, letting light pour into the once dismal rooms. The garden, cleared of its choking weeds and brambles, was now a neat patch of turned earth, with rows of young herbs and vegetables pushing through the dark soil. The air smelled of damp earth, new leaves, and faintly, from the workshop window, of linseed oil and ink. The house was alive again, breathing in the soft spring air. Inside, the workshop was the heart of the home, a place of quiet, focused creation. The tools were clean, the pigments arranged in a rainbow of possibility, the vellums stacked and waiting, soot, no longer a skeletal stray, but a sleek and confident panther of a cat, slept in a patch of warm sunlight that fell across the scrubbed floorboards. Ruth sat at her mother's desk. In her hand, she held a fine-tipped brush, a tool that now felt like an extension of her own fingers. Before her lay a page her mother had started but never finished, a magnificent illuminated letter R. For weeks, she had studied her mother's techniques, practicing on scrap vellum until her hand was steady and her eye was true. Now she was ready. She dipped the brush into a small pool of liquid gold leaf and, holding her breath, touched the tip to the page. She laid down a perfect, shimmering curve of light, completing a design begun 20 years before. She was not merely restoring a house, she was continuing a conversation, finishing a sentence her mother had started. She looked at her work, at the peaceful, light-filled room, at the gentle landscape outside her window. A quiet sense of belonging, profound and unshakable, settled over her. She murmured the words to the quiet room, a truth she had earned with her own 2 hands. "She did not leave me a house," she said softly. "She left me a trade." Thank you for staying with us through Ruth's journey to the very end. Her story reminds us that the most valuable inheritances are often not of property or wealth, but of purpose and skill. If you were moved by this tale of quiet vindication, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to our channel for more stories like this one. We look forward to seeing you again next time.